We crunched the numbers and we worked out that in London alone, last year, women earned £70 billion less than men. So if you're looking at what's affordable housing for young women who are twice as likely as young men to spend more than half of their income on rent, again, that's something that we need to be considering when we do that. And our other approach, the other policy that we would want to bring to this cross-party collaboration is to ring-fence funds for housing for London's most vulnerable people, so the women and children who are trying to get away from domestic violence at home. We know that there is a big problem with domestic violence in London. There were 146,000 incidents reported in the last year. That is huge. And the refugees are on their knees, they are suffering from funding cuts, and the housing crisis means that there are fewer homes than ever.
On the 14th of February 2018, the leader of the UK Women's Equality Party sparked a minor Twitter storm when she claimed that the vast majority of homeless people in the United Kingdom are women. In response to public criticism, which she described as male fury, she stood her ground, insisting that her statement was accurate and that anyone disbelieving her should contact the homeless charity whose research she was citing. So that is exactly what I have done, and in this video I will be calling shenanigans on Sophie Walker's dangerously disingenuous calculation. As the clip at the start of this video helps to illustrate, radical feminists do very often make the conscious decision to present statistical data in an unnecessarily dramatic, not to mention dismissive and divisive manner. But in fairness to Sophie Walker, just because something sounds completely crazy doesn't necessarily mean it isn't true. And so before we consider why I think that her claim that the vast majority of homeless people in the United Kingdom are women is so dangerously disingenuous and important to challenge, I also think it's important to first establish why it's also sort of true. Sort of. Sophie's claim is based on research conducted by Shelter, who are one of the UK's biggest homeless charities, which last year estimated that there were more than 300,000 homeless people in Britain today. Now, hopefully most people watching will understand that homelessness is a complex and often hidden problem, and that the most extreme examples that can be shamefully witnessed on the streets of every major city in the UK are sadly only the most apparent and striking representations of a much bigger problem, which, as Shelter correctly point out in their report, has been significantly compounded in recent years by drastic changes to statutory housing benefit allowances and the ongoing shortage of affordable homes, especially in heavily populated areas like London. You don't always have to be sleeping on the streets or not have a roof over your head to be considered homeless. And crucially for Sophie's claim, there are plenty of homeless people living in hostels and shelters and households living in temporary accommodation who are defined as statutory homeless because they are owed a statutory homeless duty by a local authority, which is how Shelter not unreasonably came to the troubling conclusion that as many as 1 in every 200 people living in Britain today could reasonably be described as homeless, and that the very vast majority of them are in fact living in short-term temporary accommodation. For the uninitiated, local authorities have a duty to secure accommodation for people or households considered to be unintentionally homeless who fall into a priority need category. Bizarrely, not having a pot to piss in or a roof over your head at night is not in and of itself sufficient to qualify as having a priority need, which means that local councils do not have a statutory duty to secure accommodation for all homeless people, which means that people without accommodation who for qualifying and statistical purposes are not considered to be statutory homeless are most likely to be the many men, but also increasingly women, we see reduced to sleeping in the doorsteps of our great cities. And Sophie is indeed correct to say that there are significantly higher proportions of women identified in the statutory homeless statistical category than there are amongst those classified as rough sleepers or hidden homeless. And she would also be correct to say say that there is a significantly higher population of people classified as statutory homeless than any other estimated category of homeless people, which is not to say that she is correct to claim that the very vast majority of homeless people in the UK are women. And while we're looking at her claim a little more closely for added context, we might as well debunk another dangerously disingenuous myth that a lot of feminist politicians like Sophie Walker have been consistently trying to push for a number of years now.
Austerity is a feminist issue. Budget cuts make life harder for a lot of people. But did you know that since 2010, up to 86% of savings to the Treasury have fallen on women?
Now, call me pedantic if you must, but one immediate problem I have with Sophie's claim is that it's a little bit racist in a typically metropolitan elite intelligentsia kind of way. Because when you look under the hood of Shelter's headline statistic, one of the first things we find is that it doesn't actually include any data from one of the 4 countries that the United Kingdom is comprised of, and subsequently Shelter, if not Sophie, correctly described their findings as relating to Great Britain only. Indeed, their calculations for Scotland and Wales are essentially estimates based on the hard data that they had to work with from English councils. But even though it is incredibly difficult to get especially accurate data on homelessness, and even though Shelter's estimate is considerably higher than official government figures, I for one have no reason to suspect that the report isn't a fair reflection of just how many people are having an incredibly difficult time finding or keeping a roof to live under. That being said, I was genuinely surprised to discover that even though they do track trends in relation to ethnicity and age, neither Shelter nor indeed the Parliamentary Research Library, who prepared a recent briefing on statutory homelessness in England, could signpost me to any particular useful data providing a breakdown of homeless people by sex or gender, which means that Sophie's claim is at least to some degree presumably based on anecdotal evidence as opposed to any specific citation she could point to in Shelter's actual report. Because if it exists, Shelter's extremely polite and helpful spokesperson wasn't aware of it. Indeed, I had to do a surprising amount of digging before I could find something that might offer a reasonably accurate indication as to exactly where Sophie was coming from. Councils in England are required to give government a breakdown of the number of households who apply for help each quarter and are found to be homeless. And I eventually established from their most recent quarterly summary that 57% of the head of households accepted as being statutory homeless over that particular period were definitely women. Now, saying that 57% could be described as the very vast majority of anything would be a bit like saying that the very vast majority of people in the UK voted for Brexit, a suggestion that I very much doubt the distinctly Europhile Women's Equality Party would agree with. And that figure obviously doesn't include the number of people who fell through the state's statutory safety nets and had their applications rejected, or didn't even submit one, nor indeed does it include people described as the hidden homeless, sofa surfing with friends and family, who aren't even included in Shelter's headline 300,000 souls statistic. Now, in the interest of full disclosure, I should say that the total number of women helped will be higher than 57%, because I haven't included the 20% of households categorised as couples with children. But I haven't done that for a very specific reason, and if you bear with me, in a few minutes I'll explain exactly why. Even so, all of this data does actually help to establish that Shelter's snapshot of the extent of homelessness in Britain does definitely indicate that women are experiencing some form of homelessness at higher rates than men, and that single mothers and their children are by far the largest group of households qualifying for temporary accommodation provided to people who qualify as having priority needs. And given that homelessness is often considered to be a predominantly male problem, highlighting the precarious plight of many vulnerable women experiencing homelessness is absolutely fair enough as far as it's fair enough, as is highlighting the fact that the shortage of affordable housing is a massive part of the overall problem. But with a little help from a clip from a classic British film, I'm now going to begin to unravel why, even if Sophie's claim is sort of correct, in my humble subjective opinion, people were entirely right to call her on her fairly obvious shenanigans. For the uninitiated, Cathy Come Home is a much lauded 1966 BBC television play about homelessness, which has been described as one of the most influential British television programmes of all time, and an ice pick in the brain of all who saw it. It was instrumental in the creation of the homeless charity Crisis, and also significantly aided in the development of Shelter, who by a remarkable coincidence had been launched just a few days earlier. It tells the story of Cathy, a young mother of 3, and her descent into poverty and eventual homelessness. Filmed in a documentary style new to television viewers at the time, it has very much lasted the test of time and still hits hard today, especially the final scene where authority figures find her sleeping rough in a train station and take 2 of her sons into care. And it is this scene that I'm going to use to illustrate the logic that informs the Women's Equality Party's approach to gender auditing. It's a tragic scene which legislation like the Homeless Act of 2002 is designed to prevent, and from a gender monitoring perspective, it shows the plight of 3 homeless people, 66% of whom are male. But what people like Sophie Walker see are 3 ticks to her side of the tally that adds up to the conclusion that the very vast majority of homeless people are women. Because as Sophie even clarified in her follow-up tweet, the single largest population within Shelter's headline figure of 307,000 people, which comprise of 130,000 children, are, for the purposes of Sophie's manifesto, all counted as women. It's the same trick that the increasingly powerful feminist caucus in the Labour Party are pulling when they claim that women are paying between 3 and 4 times more than men to bring down the country's deficit. A fact which not only has to ignore the inconvenient fact that as a simple homogeneous group, men put considerably more into the public purse than they take out, but even more disgracefully counts all child benefits and tax credits as money owed to women, and entirely screens dads out of the family units when considering the impact that austerity measures have had on British households, which is fortunately something that councils no longer do when arranging temporary accommodation for statutory homeless households, unlike last century, as anyone who has seen Cathy Come Home will know. Playing fast and loose with a head count of vulnerable children isn't the only reason Sophie's insistence that the majority of homeless people in the UK are women doesn't entirely sit well, not least after she posted a tweet essentially inferring that the people taking issue with her claim were abusing her. People including journalist and author Peter Lloyd, who's written extensively on the challenges faced by men in the 21st century, and who flagged the concern that the feminist movements appear to be attempting to reframe the issue of homelessness to make it about women. But Walker's retort to this suggestion was the not entirely unreasonable claim that working to address the crisis of people living in temporary accommodation will help everyone affected by homelessness. And it's certainly not an unreasonable argument, nor is it unreasonable to highlight the fact that many women experience homelessness, a fact that can certainly sometimes be overlooked. But for a party leader whose manifesto is packed full of policy informed by the very socialist concept of equality of outcome, her narrative proposing that men actually only make up a tiny proportion of the 300,000 homeless people in the UK does admit at least one very significant fact about homelessness in the year 2018. Because as anyone walking the streets of London who has ever had the decency to look a rough sleeper in the eye can tell you, the very vast majority of them are men, as are the very vast majority of people who fall all the way through the various safety nets that our apparently patriarchal state systems have put in place, and tragically freeze to death on our cold, wet streets every year. 90%, in fact. A fact rather tragically underlined within hours of Sophie's tweet, with the news that a rough sleeper had frozen to death overnight, literally a stone's throw away from Parliament, leading numerous politicians to express their condolences and reflect on the fact that the number of estimated people rough sleeping in this country has risen year on year for the best part of a decade. A cold fact that unsurprisingly is not on the radar of a female supremacist lobby masquerading as a political party, or, if you like, a political party who have to date secured less of a mandate at the ballot box than Britain First and the monster raving loony party. And as we unpeel one last layer of the research report that Sophie interprets as telling us that the very vast majority of homeless people in the UK are women, and for anyone with any remaining doubts about the matter, hopefully it will become clear why, in my humble subjective opinion at least, Sophie's unique vision of equality for everyone is unlikely to make things better for anyone, with the possible exception of a very small minority of middle-aged, middle-class and predominantly white, well-educated and already independently wealthy women. And to begin with, let's dip back into the BBC's archive and pull out something that is sadly not from last century, but from February 2017, less than a year after Sophie Walker was playing fast and loose with gendered statistics during her attempts to be elected as Mayor of London, and in the process pledging that if elected she would ring-fence a proportion of London's housing investment to build more women's refuges.
Good evening, I'm Asad Ahmed. Domestic violence is soaring in London, where men find themselves as the victims. Official figures show an 80% rise in reported attacks, with London being described as the worst place in the country to be a male victim. Well, that's partly because there isn't a single safe house in the city, so you'd have to go to the Midlands or the South Coast for the nearest one. This special report is by Ben Hunt.
It started with a slap and escalated into a full-scale bashing.
This is sadly a familiar story, but one we don't often hear from men. Dan was just 25 when the violent abuse started from his partner.
There was nobody I could approach, even when my friends or people at work would see my black eyes or my broken collarbone. Nobody felt comfortable addressing it. I felt trapped. What I needed was a safe space for a few days, but because I'm a man, there was nothing on offer except advice. At the very least, there needs to be safe spaces for men in central London. If councils provide full support to male victims, men will step forward to take it.
Dan is one of thousands of men to suffer from domestic abuse in London.
Hello, Men's Advice Line, how can I help?
Last year, the UK's leading domestic violence charity received over 3,000 calls to its helpline from London men, a fifth of all its calls nationally. They believe what's really lacking are council-run refuges for men in need.
Men asking for emergency accommodation in London have nowhere to go. Their options are to face homelessness or carry on living with their abusive partner.
BBC London has learned that in 2012, the Met Police handled over 9,000 reports from male victims of domestic abuse. In 2015, this had risen to over 16,000. That's an 80% increase. With the number of male victims rising, we contacted all London boroughs to explore what they were doing to address the problem and see what victim support services they provided. We found that 18 areas in England and Wales do provide refuges for men. However, for victims in London, we discovered there isn't one single refuge available for male victims of domestic abuse. Men are not always willing to go and get help, and sometimes that is part of the problem in tackling this issue.
The issue for men when they are a victim is that they feel a sense of damaged pride, they fear not being believed. Where do they go? How do they get help? London is the worst place in the country to be a male victim of domestic abuse.
Men, just like women, need places to go if they are the victims of domestic violence that are safe, that do provide refuge. We view those spaces, or we are increasingly viewing those, as kind of an automatic right for women. Why aren't they a right for men?
Domestic abuse catches people by surprise. That is why councils need to make sure they have services available if men do suddenly need them.
Survivors such as Dan hope their experiences will influence policymakers, and refuges and safe spaces for men will be created across the capital. Ben Hunt, BBC London News.
If you've seen my short video on the truth about Labour MP Jess Phillips's truth about domestic violence...
It happens to men too, you know. Do you want a point? It happens to men as well. Oh, yeah, okay.
Then you'll have a good idea about just how poorly male victims of domestic violence are currently served by state-funded specialist services, both in terms of equality of opportunity and often tragically equality of outcome. And if you remember back to the start of this video, you could quite possibly be under the impression that there were 146,000 incidents of violence against women and girls in London in the year 2016. Now again, in a technical way, Sophie is technically right to suggest such a thing, because technically in England, for statistical purposes, the police record all incidents of domestic violence as violence against women and girls. This despite the fact that decades of empirical evidence show that incidents of intimate partner violence are most commonly reciprocal in nature, and that it is commonly understood that 1 in 3 adult victims of domestic violence in the UK are men, or 1 in 4 if we're considering data specifically from London. Confusingly, numerous reports in the media indicated that the number of incidents for the relevant period had significantly risen to a significantly smaller number than the 146,000 incidents quoted by Sophie. But I've little doubt that she will have based her claim on some version of reality, and either way, she quite disgracefully, consciously excludes men from her commitment to help vulnerable Londoners, while at the same time inflating her numbers by counting in all incidents involving male victims. This is not a unique occurrence when it comes to the way that radical feminists approach solutions to domestic violence, including some who work in the domestic violence sector, who lobby and campaign exclusively for ring-fenced funds for women-only services delivered by women-only organisations like Women's Aid. As an aside, you may have noticed the recent headlines about Sisters on Cut storming the red carpet at the BAFTAs to protest cuts to specialist domestic violence services. The Guardian has described them as modern-day suffragettes, and while perhaps that a not unreasonable comparison, a less fashionable fact about them is that there is one type of specialist service that they don't campaign about, and the clue is in their motto, which is "Good night, men's rights." Polly Nate, who was until recently the CEO of Women's Aid, has recently taken over the reins at the homeless charity shelter, and worryingly has committed that the values nurtured by her time with that organisation will continue to inform everything that she does in her new role. Worryingly, because she has previously played down the significance of national statistics showing the frequency of male victims, only to later significantly play up the very same statistics when lobbying for women-only services. Worryingly, because it is commonly understood that breakdowns in relationships, especially violent ones, are a very common cause of people becoming homeless. And worryingly for Londoners, services for male victims remain extremely limited, as does the political will to change things. And London continues to have a significantly higher ratio of both homelessness and incidents of domestic violence than the national average. And ironically, the council area with the highest incidence of domestic violence and one of the highest incidences of homelessness in the entire United Kingdom is run by none other than Mr. Sophie Walker. Perhaps she should have a word. in the absence of a male equivalent, the government's violence against women and girls strategy shores up the most transparent example of institutional, state-sponsored direct sex discrimination that I, for one, can think of. And the year-on-year increasing numbers of rough sleepers is nothing short of a national scandal. But having hopefully convinced you why I believe that Sophie Walker's rather blunt claim deserves to be demystified and debunked, I want to end on a positive note and perhaps even extend a tiny fig leaf to any modern feminists who are watching, because issues like homelessness and domestic violence are far too important to be reduced to gendered funding turf wars, and solutions do most often happen for everyone when everyone works together. The day before Sophie Walker's dubious claim about the comparative lack of male homeless people, The Guardian's beauty columnist Sally Hughes launched an initiative called Beauty Banks, aimed at helping to address hygiene poverty, which is based on the understanding that more than half of families reliant on food banks say they can't afford to buy basic toiletries. Now, fair enough, I probably wouldn't have personally gone with the name Beauty Banks, but in fairness to Sally, it is a very simple and positive initiative aimed at generating donations of simple sanitary products like tampons, razors and toothpaste for distribution to people in need, whether they're living on the streets, in shelters, on someone else's sofa or in temporary accommodation. And crucially, Sally is encouraging donations of products used by people of as many genders as you can possibly imagine. So I thought I'd support her by making a donation, and I'd encourage you all to think about supporting this or similar initiatives. And she even has a wish list on Amazon to make it easy, and you can donate as many manly products as you want, or even a bit of a mixture, because despite what people like David Cameron and Sophie Walker might say or do, at the end of the day, we are all in this together.